are based upon a sense of entitlement, that this is a narrative, a story of history that is taught in Chinese schools rigorously, where no questioning is really allowed, and it leads to a confidence and a way of behaving on the assumption that the Chinese view of history is correct. So, and I think that's very hard to tackle, because you end up with two competing worldviews, and you end up with literally in some cases, a military confrontation between different claimants. So my ambition is to try to undermine that sense of confidence by showing how flimsy the Chinese claim is, and by using Chinese documents to show how this claim is in fact a giant mistake, or a series of mistakes, so that hopefully when you next encounter a Chinese official telling you about the ancient origins of China's claim, you will be able to politely disagree with them by showing them some facts. Could we get a couple of the first slide up, if that's possible? Otherwise, I'll just keep whittering on. I came into this because I started to write a book, like in 2011, I suppose it was, nearly 15 years ago. And I thought it was going to be a very easy book to write, because so much had been written on the South China Sea and the history of it. But the more I looked at some of the texts about the history, I kept on finding literally the same sentences that had been copied and pasted into different history books and articles and things. And I thought, well, where do these phrases come from? And I traced them all back, and so many of the standard texts of that time could all be traced back to 2 or 3 newspaper articles that were published in China in 1933. And everything else had basically borrowed from and copied from. So my initial explorations into this were to try and critique this and find out whether these stories were reliable. And I ended up writing a different account of the origins of China's claim. Next slide, please. Okay, so briefly, what does China claim? Next slide. So here we have the Chinese government's, the PRC's white paper, issued on exactly the same day as the arbitral tribunal ruling back in 2016. And they make 4 points in that. Sovereignty over Nanhai Judao. Now, this in itself is a problem. There is no single Nanhai South Sea Judao archipelago, okay? Consisting of Dongsha, i.e. Pratas Island, Xisha, the Paracels, Zhongsha, meaning Macclesfield Bank, and Nansha, the Spratlys, okay? So they're trying to argue that those 4 entirely separate features, one of which isn't even an archipelago at all, somehow comprise a single feature called Nanhai Judao, okay? South Sea Archipelago, okay? Then, part 3 is one I think we can probably all agree with, that China has an exclusive economic zone. Sure. Maybe a continental shelf, maybe. But based on Nanhai Judao, that somehow all 4 bits of the island are connected, no? And then this is the other problem, historic rights, okay? And I'll talk a little bit about the historic rights, but I'm mainly going to address the territorial claims. Next slide. So, as we all know, as if you've been paying attention during the day, there are 2 types of claims. There are, in short, who owns the islands and what can you do in the spaces in between the islands, yeah? So territorial and maritime. But the historic rights claim tends to confuse the 2. Okay, so I'm really going to talk today about the territorial stuff. I'm not going to talk about the maritime things. Next slide. China has put out plenty of material about ancient rights, ancient claims. This was the white paper that it issued back in 2000. And it kicks off with a claim saying it goes all the way back, 2,000 years to this document, the Yiwu Ji, And it has a quote in English: "There are islets, sand keys, reefs, and banks in the South China Sea. The water is shallow." Da, da, da. Okay, so this looks solid, yeah. The 2,000-year-old document produced in China showing a claim to the South China Sea. Next slide, please. But if you actually go and try and find the original document, and of course the problem is the original document doesn't exist. What we have is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. But Johannes Kurtz, very good scholar, a German scholar of Chinese history, found the oldest copy, and it basically says there are rugged stones in the rising sea. Doesn't say which sea. The word South China Sea is not there. And then it says foreigners reinforce their ships with sheet metal, i.e. foreign people are sailing through the South China Sea here, not Chinese people, okay? So there's no claim to the South China Sea here. In fact, the text undermines Chinese claims. So you should always be skeptical of every single, quote, ancient Chinese document that is put forward in support of China's claims. Next slide, please. So as you know, 1870, maps of China, no islands, paracels non-existent, and it keeps going forward. No knowledge really of the South China Sea at that time. We can keep going forward in time. We don't get the islands don't appear on Chinese maps until 1909. Next slide. So this is the map that China sent to the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf in May 2009, with the dashes on, as we all know and love, okay? This map was based on this map, which was originally published by the Republic of China in November 1947. And again, we can see dashes. Here there are more dashes. There are some in the Gulf of Tonkin here. And the Americans very kindly put one map on top of the other. There is a map which and it shows that the dashes are not in the same place. So these are not precisely drawn dashes by any means. But how do we get to this map? So this is what I really want to talk about, is how does this map originate, which means telling the story of how this map originated here. Next slide, please. And this map, which was published in November, December 47, was based on a sketch map which was drawn for internal purposes. These are all documents, by the way, from the Republic of China archives, which are in Taipei. And this was drawn for discussions in the middle of 1946, after the end of the Second World War. Next slide, please. And the reason that they were drawing this was because the Republic of China had a meeting on the 25th of September 1946. The archives are all in Taipei. And they minuted the purposes of this meeting, which was how to delimit the scope of what is to be received for the purposes of receiving each of the islands of the South China Sea. So the word receiving appears twice in the same sentence. The source, by the way, is Chris Chung, Canadian academic. Last time I met him, he was on secondment in the Canadian Foreign Ministry. So really good scholar. And there's a couple of things here. The first is that this is after the Second World War. This is after the defeat of Japan. And this is the ROC, China, deciding which islands to claim in the South China Sea, because it doesn't know. And the other thing which is really important to understand is that this line, this dashed line, has nothing to do with a maritime claim. It's to decide which islands are to be claimed. So the idea that this in any way denoted a claim to historic waters or historic rights is non-existent, okay? Back in the original meeting in 1946, it was just about thinking about what islands to claim. Next one, please. So this is the question. Why did Republic of China officials think in these terms in 1946? Next one. So I will blame the Chinese claim on 4 people. Li Jun in 1909 and came back in 1933. He's the main culprit, Bai Mei-chu, 1936, and then these guys after the Second World War. Okay, these are the people who are mostly responsible. Okay, next one. So the trigger, and I remember in this afternoon, Clive was talking about the importance of bird poo. Okay, bird poo is critical to the history of the South China Sea. It's all about guano, and if you didn't have fertilizer in the early 20th century, you wanted guano, okay? Countries grew rich and then rapidly poor because of the guano trade. Japanese, in particular, are very active, and in 1907, a Japanese merchant lands on Pratas Island, Dongshan Chinese, to dig up guano and export it. And given the nationalistic fervor of the time, anti-Japanese feeling in China, this becomes a big issue. And there are big protests, particularly in 1909, when it's discovered that a Japanese merchant is making profits out of Chinese bird poo. And it becomes a boycott, there are protests, and eventually the Japanese government says to the Chinese officials, if you can find a good reason why Pratas belongs to you, then we'll make an agreement. And so this is the first time that Chinese officials go looking in ancient documents, old documents, trying to find some evidence that Pratas belongs to China. And eventually they find some mention of it in an old document, and the Japanese, in exchange for a large sum of money, agree to cede the sovereignty of Pratas to China. So 1909, for the first time, China discovers the Paracel Islands, okay? Discovers Dongsha, Pratas Island, and in the process then launches an expedition to go to the Paracel Islands in the northern part of the South China Sea. Next one. So we have a series of newspaper articles talking about activities on Pratas, and then because of the anxiety about Pratas, they then think about, they're told about the existence of the Paracels, and they launch an expedition to the Paracels, and that's the very first time that any Chinese state goes and claims the Paracel Islands, goes and sticks a flag in it, and they act in the same way that Europeans did by firing off cannons and all that sort of thing. Next slide. But the Chinese interest in the Paracel Islands lasts about 2 weeks, because already June, just a few days after the expedition goes to the Paracels and comes back, it says, the authorities are reported to be converting the islands into a penal settlement. They can't think of anything to do with the Paracel Islands. There's nothing there apart from some turtles. So all they can think of to do is to maybe put some prisoners there. And even after that, they get bored. And then there's the Chinese Revolution in 1911-12. They completely forget about it. The people that they sent to Pratas, I think, all starved to death because they were not resupplied with food. So when we talk about whether an island can support human habitation, they more or less proved that it couldn't. And then as late as 1920, you get the British and other merchants complaining that the Chinese are not taking an interest in the islands. There's no lighthouse, there's nothing, ships are still being wrecked there. There's some other stuff which goes on in the 20s, but in the interest of time, I will press on. Next slide, please. Really, I mean, I'm focusing here on the Chinese claims, so I'm not talking so much about what the Japanese were up to, or what the French were up to, or indeed what the British were up to, or the Americans for that time. But in the 30s, it becomes complex. You get moves by Japan, you get moves by France. France starts to claim the Paracels in 1931, and then in 1932, it takes quite a few months, the Chinese government formally rejects the French claim to the Paracels. So this is starting to kind of become an issue in 1931, 1932, coming into 1933. And the anxiety about territory in China and where its boundaries should be is starting to grow in early 1933. Next slide, please. And this anxiety really goes up a level in 1933, because on Bastille Day, the 14th of July, 1933, the French claim the six islands of the Spratlys down here. I'm missing out some details here, but just in the interest. So this is a moment when China erupts in July 1933 in protest of what the French have done. But it becomes very clear that the Chinese authorities have absolutely no idea where the Spratly Islands are. They've never heard of them before, partly because the French have confused them by using French names for them. But in general, they just don't know where they are. So next slide. It becomes very clear that the Chinese don't understand the difference between the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands. And so another Chinese document, here is the Chinese Navy sending a telegram or a note to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, basically saying there aren't any islands there. Yeah? That you must be mistaken. The French seem to have claimed an area of empty sea. So this is quite clearly proof, again, a Taiwanese, in the Taiwan archives, that for the Chinese authorities, they did not know where the Spratly Islands existed. And in fact, it was only, and you may know François-Xavier Bonnet, who's a French scholar based in Philippines. He's found a document which suggests it was only when the Chinese ambassador to Manila went to see the Americans and got an American map that they realized that there were two different sets of islands. Next one, please. And so this was when this guy, Li Jun, he was the guy that organized the expedition back in 1909 to the Paracels. And in 1933, he pops up in the newspapers saying, these islands that the French have claimed, they're the ones that I claimed back in 1909. So he is responsible for confusing the Chinese public about the two different islands. And basically saying, these are our islands, the Spratlys, when in fact the islands that he had been to were the Paracels, different set of islands. Next one. And this causes lots of anxiety. There are demonstrations in the streets. There are letters in the newspapers. And it forces the Republic of China Ministry of Foreign Affairs in its official gazette to actually deny any claim to the Spratly Islands as late as 1933. So it says Dongsha, i.e. Pratas and Sisha, they've always been part of our territory. We can argue about that. But the point is, there is no claim to the Spratly Islands at this point in 1933. In fact, the Chinese are explicitly rejecting a claim to the Spratly Islands. Okay, next one, please. And you can tell this in a couple of ways. One is that, Triton Island in the Paracels is known in Chinese as Nanjidao, the southernmost island. An explanation here because it's the southernmost point of Chinese territory, the Paracel Islands, okay, 1933. Keep going. All right? But this whole episode causes confusion, consternation in Chinese official circles, so they convene a committee to try and work out which islands are which, and what their names are in English, and what they should be in Chinese. And this committee is formed in 1933 and then reports in 1935. If you want the texts, another Chinese document has got the text in. And if you read Chinese, what you'll see is that all of these so-called Chinese names are simply translations or transliterations of the English names. Scarborough Reef, Sigabalo, yeah, simply Scarborough, the name of an English seaside town which became the name of a British ship which wrecked on Scarborough Shoal and gave its name to Scarborough Shoal, is then translated into Chinese. My favorite one is, in Chinese, is Jinyindao, which is Money Island. That's literally the translation, Chinese word for money, Jinyin. It's actually named after a British guy who was the manager of the East India Company Navy, who was called William Money. He gave his name to the island. It was then translated into Chinese. It's still today called Jinyindao. Next slide. So where did this list of names come from? Well, there was a big clue that on the Chinese list there are 7 features which we now know because of modern map making that don't exist. So the only document I can find that has the same list of non-existent features is the British South China Sea Directory of 1906. So my guess is that they simply copied the list out of this British document and then gave it Chinese names. Okay? So this is how the Chinese claim came to be made, simply by copying. We heard a little bit about China earlier in Clive's talk about copying of English maps, British maps. Next slide, please. And then again, these are examples of these names. So, North Danger is literally Beixian. Guess what Beixian means in Chinese? North Danger. Yeah? Spratly. Sibala Tuo, Spratly. Yeah? Just Antelope Reef, also in the Paracels. Lin Jiao. British ship, the Antelope was the survey ship. is now known in Chinese as Linyanjiao Antelope Reef. So they're just translations and transliterations. Worth pointing out that the names were changed. 35 is the first list. 1947, the Republic of China changed some of them. So that's when Scarborough Shoal, Sigobaolo becomes Minzu Reef, Democracy Reef, as if a fisherman is going to call an island Democracy Reef. And then the communists changed the names again, some of them in 1983. So that's when you get Huayang, isn't it? So yellow rock for Scarborough Shoal. So that's why Scarborough Shoal has changed its name 3 times during the 20th century. Okay, the naming is important for the next bit. If you go to the next slide. So, one of the features, James Shoal, the Chinese name is Zhengmu, which is simply the transliteration of James, J-M, Zhengmu, okay? But they didn't know how to translate the word shoal. Shoal is an old English word, it means shallow, okay? So they gave it a Chinese name, Tan, okay? Tan is a sandbank. A sandbank can be below the water or it can be above the water, okay? So it was a kind of ambiguous name for it, okay? The name has subsequently changed to become Zhengmu Ansha, which is hidden sand, which is a bit more, literally true. But this ambiguity of what tan meant was critical for the next stage. Okay, next one. 35. Along comes this guy, Bai Mei-chu. He is the grandfather of bad claims in the South China Sea. Self-taught. He was a geographer, Clive. Sorry, you and me both geographers. He was a bad geographer. Okay, he published his own atlas in 1936. Yeah, well, ambitious, yeah. He went further than the evidence allowed, okay? And he was a nationalist, and he wanted to defend China's claims. This is the 1930s, conflict with France, conflict with Japan in particular, rivalry with other imperial powers. But he wanted to do his bit to defend the country. Next slide, please. And so he published this atlas, and in this atlas was a map. And in this map, you can see he drew a red line all around what he thought were China's rightful claims. And if you zoom in on his atlas, the South China Sea bit here, you will see that not only has he invented a whole load of islands here which don't really exist and missed off quite a few, but he has turned the James Shoal, which we all know is 22 meters below sea level, doesn't exist, into an island. He's drawn a little line around it and colored it in. And the same here. So here we are, Zhengmu Tan, and this is Chanwei Tan, which is Chanwei is vanguard in Chinese. So that's Vanguard Bank. And this is Haima Tan, Seahorse Shoal over here. All of these features are actually underwater. But because of this word tan, he has thought that they were islands, that they were sandbanks. And he has turned them into islands on his map, and then he has drawn his big red line around it. This is the origin of the U-shaped line, the 9-dash line here, and he drew it because he didn't understand the meaning of the English word shoal, okay, and because of the bad translation in 1935. Okay, next one. So you can see here, invented islands, Seahorse Bank, Vanguard Bank, James Shoal here. But the interesting question is, why did he pick on these 3 underwater features, which he'd never been to, had no idea that they existed or whatever? Why did he pick these features to draw his line around, okay? And this is my theory. I wasn't there, I can't prove it, but no one has yet contradicted me, okay? I think, next map, that all he did, can we flip the next one? All he did was copy a British map. Maybe this one, published in London in 1918, and you'll see Seahorse Bank, James Shoal, Vanguard Bank, all mentioned, all with little dotted lines around them, which as good geographers understand would mean underwater, submerged, can't see it. But he didn't understand, and so he drew them as solid lines and then colored them in and turned them into islands that didn't actually exist. So the origin of China's claims in the South China Sea, the 9-dash line, is a misinterpretation of this map that was fed through bad translations that were done by a Chinese government committee in the 1930s. Okay, next one, please. I'll just put this in here simply because it follows in the time. And sometimes, I mean, even in the Manila Dialogue in November, where you hear a Chinese official saying that the Cairo Declaration promised the Spratlys and the Paracels to China. Okay? Here's the text of the Cairo Declaration. The words Paracels and Spratlys don't even appear. Okay? So the idea that in 1943 the Allies promised the islands of the South China Sea to China is not true. The only islands mentioned are Formosa, i.e. Taiwan, and the Pescadores, which are between the main island of Taiwan and the PRC coast. So let's just forget about the Cairo Declaration, all right? The most important thing is that that after the Second World War, after the defeat of Japan, China has to decide where its new boundaries are going to be. And it hires, the Ministry of Interior hire a couple of geography professors, more geographers, Zheng Jiu and Fu Jiaojin. The important thing to remember about these guys is that they were both students of Bai Meiqiu. He taught them at Beijing University, Beijing Normal University, okay? And in the 30s, I think he went off to Japan to go and learn the kind of fascist geography they taught in Japan in the 1930s. He went off to Germany and learned the kind of geography that they taught you in Germany in the 1930s, which was presumably a lot of stuff about territory and things like that. Anyway, they came back and they were advising the Ministry of Interior in China after the Second World War. And it was them that brought Bai Meiqiu's line and his claims into official government Chinese government thinking at that time. Up until that point, Bai Meiqiu's line had just been a line on a map drawn by a geography professor, but these guys turned that line into a real territorial claim. And then here we see this guy on the expedition to the Spratly Islands in December 1946 on the ROC naval expedition. Next one, please. And so there he is there on his ship. And then this is the map which is then drawn in 1947 after the expedition down to the Spratlys. There's two groups of ships go to the Paracels, two go down to the Spratlys, and they land in Ituaba, stick their thing there. But even at this stage, this map down here, if you zoom in, there's a confusion. And this is the moment when Zhengmu Tan becomes Zhengmu Ansha, and both names are actually written on this, printed on this map down here. Okay, next one. So, but even as late as spring 1947, the Chinese government is still arguing about whether or not to claim these islands. So Lin Zun, he was the guy who was actually in charge of the expedition. He realized that these islands, they're quite close to the Philippines, you know, and wasn't sure that China actually had a claim. But it wasn't until April 1947 that the committee said, okay, enough objections, we're now going to claim the James Shoal as being the southernmost point of China. But of course, they had to say they reaffirmed it. Of course, it had never been affirmed in the first place. But that meeting in April 1947 is the one that actually decides that the James Shoal and the rest of the U-shaped line is going to be the Chinese claim. Next one. But you can see the transition in China's claims. So this is an official book which was published by the Republic of China, Ministry of Information. The first edition was published in 1943 during the Second World War. The second edition was published in 1947, immediately after the Second World War. Page 1, it says, there's a copy of this one in the SOAS Library in London. There's a copy of that one in the British Library. Jive 43, it says, the southernmost bit of China is the Paracel Group. Yeah? Pretty clear, black and white. 4 years later, the southernmost bit of territory has moved 500 kilometers south to the Tuansha. Okay? Tuansha was what the Spratly Islands were called in China in the 1930s. I think it sort of means the dangerous lands, basically like dangerous ground. This is before the Nansha before the term Nansha was used. And even here, they're saying that the Tuansha Islands are contested between China, the Commonwealth of the Philippines and Indochina. So as late as 1997, the official Chinese government document is saying these are contested with the other claimants, including the Commonwealth of the Philippines. Okay, so this really should be enough to shut up most Chinese claimants to the Spratlys as late as 1943. Okay, next one. So, but what's really sort of tragic is that these non-existent islands are exactly where the clashes are taking place today. Yeah. So you've got the Reed Bank. So you've got Luconia Shoals. You've got Vanguard Bank. Here you'd have the bits off Natuna as well. This is exactly where the trouble is being caused, and it all goes back to the map of non-existent islands drawn in 1936. Okay. Next one. So, if you were to just draw a kind of line around, the actual physical features that you can see above the water at high tide, you could basically kind of, parcel off that bit of the South China Sea and argue about that, and then let the coastal states get on with developing their gas reserves, Wouldn't it be so much easier for the Philippines if that natural gas was flowing from Reed Bank and powering your power stations now, rather than having to, sorry, Australian ambassador, import Australian gas right now? Okay. A quick mention on historic rights, okay? I've written an article about this, which I'll share with you, but just briefly to explain. So, despite its name, the historic rights claim is not historic, okay? Move on. So, if there is one man responsible for all of the trouble in the South China Sea at the moment, it's that man there, okay? Professor Fu Quan-Chen, okay? I don't know if you've ever encountered him, but we were talking about, in British and Australian academia, you have to measure, one of the things that they have to do is measure impact. How does your research impact the world? Well, this guy's research has screwed up the world, okay? He invented, sorry? Still impact, yes. You can have a tick on his university audit as a result of that. Next slide, please. So what's interesting about him is that his politics were at the right-hand end of the Kuomintang spectrum. So he was a guy who believed in unification between Taiwan and the rest and the PRC, and for him, nationalism was the most important element. So the historic rights claim really dates back to the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, when the Republic of China, under the Kuomintang, convenes a committee to examine its territorial sea and thinking about exclusive economic zone claims, obviously with UNCLOS being negotiated and in the process of being ratified. And at the same time, Professor Fu is elected to the National Assembly. There's then a task force, the South China Sea policy, and in it, this idea of historic waters, that they actually take the line and they give it a different meaning, that actually there's a claim to the waters within the South China Sea line and all the rights that go with it. And he's the guy that invents the idea of historic waters. And the tragedy is that when the PRC wrote its law on the exclusive economic zone in 1998, they included the phrase China's historic rights in the PRC law on the exclusive economic zone. And they did so because of him, okay? And it's now written into PRC law, and that's the reason why, they've stopped development of oil and gas reserves, off Philippines, off Vietnam, and tried to do the same off Malaysia and Indonesia. All goes back to that guy there, okay? For Shaz, shall I talk briefly about this? Really, I mean, it's another form of claim. Clive mentioned it a bit earlier. The idea is, and of course it was announced, in order to try and sort of scupper the arbitral ruling. It came out more or less the same week, for sure. And the idea was to sort of try and put a sort of quasi-legalistic UNCLOS type claim, even though the tribunal had just blown the idea of exclusive economic zones for the Spratlys out of the water. Next one. And so this is a map drawn by CSIS in Washington. This would be the maximal extent of a Four Shahs claim, and you can see basically it's if anything, it's even worse than the U-shaped line. And it's based on very strange reading of UNCLOS that you can actually, even if individual features don't support an economic life of their own, if you stick enough of them together, then they should. And that's broadly the Four Shahs claim. Okay, next one. But I think we do have to be a bit concerned about what China might try to do next. Is it going to try and argue that, in fact, underwater features are, in fact, territory? And then try and somehow distort UNCLOS so that they would somehow reverse engineer a sensible claim to James Shoal in particular. And you can see here, this is something that Chinese ships do when they sail through the southern part of the South China Sea, as they go down to the James Shoal, and sometimes they chuck a bit of rock over the side and say, this is Chinese territory, and then the bit of rock floats down 22 meters and sits on the seabed down there. But, are they seriously? Because it's not just James Shoal, Seahorse Bank, Vanguard Bank. The whole of the Macclesfield Bank in the center of the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, is underwater. So another nonsense claim, but maybe they'll try and, re-legitimate that somehow in the future. Next one, I think it's the end. Yes, there you go. Claiming underwater territory, All good UNCLOS scholars should be spitting feathers right now. Thank you. That's it. Okay.
Thank you, Sir Bill Hayton. And now the floor is open for the question and answer. And may I remind our participants to kindly state your name and your affiliation before raising your question. May we also invite here on stage Justice Antonio Carpio, sir.
The reason why in the 1947 Handbook of China, China claimed the Spratlys, but at the same time it said the Spratlys are also claimed by the Philippines and by Indochina, the French Indochina, is because of that map. Because the American advisors of Chiang Kai-shek came from the Philippines. Before they went to China, they came here, and they were probably conversant with that map because it's in all U.S. military offices. So when they were thinking of claiming the Spratlys, Americans probably told them that that's already claimed by the Philippines because of that map. That's my theory.
And of course, independence in July 46, and the first rhetorical claim, at least verbal claim, was made shortly after, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Clive, standing up for geographers everywhere.
Thank you so much. Not really truly a question, Clive Schofield. Creative geographer, maybe? It's long been said that all maps lie. I'd simply comment that some maps lie rather more than others.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Bill, for essentially demolishing the Chinese claim to historic rights in the South China Sea.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, it's up to you now. You've got to take it forward. Kind of everybody here. So, how would you, in taking the, I'm going to ask you a question now. How would you take the story forward from Second World War, and then kind of what happens in the Philippines and how the Philippines asserts its claim, kind of in the period after 46?
Well, from 1940, in the early 1950s, we had our story about Tomas Cloma only, and we have not done too much research. We forgot about the Treaty of Washington, and we did not go deep into the historical maps during the Spanish regime. So we have a lot of theories. First, that our Department of Foreign Affairs claimed that we have sovereignty over the Spratly Island group because of Tomas Cloma. So if you go to Pag-asa Island, I was there the other day, you see this bust of Tomas Cloma that he discovered the Kalayaan Island group, which is of course impossible because it was already called the Spratlys at that time. And the Spratly Richard Spratly sighted the Spratly Island in 1843. That was long before Tomas Cloma was born. He was born in 1904. So, and then because there was no interest really in going further, and we were stymied by the Islas Palmas case, which said that you have to occupy the land before you can get the title, but that applies only to inhabited islands. And even now, in the discourse, just in the other day, people are saying that the Chinese are saying that you have to occupy it before you can complete your title, but that legal principle applies only to inhabited islands, and Scarborough Shoal and the Spratlys were never inhabited at the time. So it's only now that we're trying really to put things together. Thank you.
Yeah, but it's interesting that what Cloma did in 1956 really starts everything going again, isn't it? Because it prompts the Taiwan Republic of China claim, it prompts Vietnam, it prompts a sort of fight between the Republic of Vietnam and the French about the Spratlys, and you start to get the PRC moving into the Parasols too. So really, that in some ways that expedition is a kind of the beginning of the modern battle for sovereignty.
Yeah, and in the arbitration at The Hague, Taiwan intervened. The Taiwan International Law Society intervened on behalf of Taiwan, but Taiwan never mentioned the 9-dash line in their pleadings. They based their claim totally in accordance with UNCLOS. So that's why I'm saying at that point, the nationalists in Taiwan, president at the time was President Ma, has made a clear position that they did not claim in the 9-dash line map. They did not claim the entire sea. They only claim islands enclosed by the 9-dash line, because the title itself, Islands in the South Sea. So they were not claiming beyond the territorial sea of those islands. And proof of that is what they claimed in the arbitration at The Hague. They base it totally in accordance with UNCLOS. Thank you.
Okay. I feel guilty that Bill is now serving as host here. So, if you have questions, please raise your hand. We have one here from Dr. Christian.
Thank you, Justice Carpio. Thank you, Bill, for wonderful presentations and your admirable capacity to go through masses of documents with a clear argument. I don't want to challenge you at all. It's more like I'd like to benefit from your knowledge. So I present, let's call it a theoretical possibility, and you tell me whether it's still a possibility or not. And that is the following. I'm only talking about the Spratly Islands. So the Spratly Islands covers a rather big area, and it's lots of features. So there is at least a theoretical possibility here that one of the coastal countries has a superior claim to one feature and another country has a superior claim to a second feature. And the implication of this possibility is, perhaps, maybe the implication of this possibility is that states need to demonstrate evidence for the claims over features individually. Now that gets us into lots of troubles when it comes to the evidence, because it seems lots of the evidence is not about specific single features, but about the area, right? So this is my question for you. What do you think about this? Thank you.
Shall I? I mean, I agree with you, 100%. I mean, it may not be a popular thing to say in this part of the world, but I think with a few exceptions, the current pattern of occupations in the South China Sea is the only one that's ever existed. There are some exceptions. Obviously, the western half of the Paracels was occupied by France and then Vietnam, and then the Chinese grabbed them in '74. And around the same time, '74, there was Southwest Key was occupied by Philippines, and then the Vietnamese grabbed it. And of course, Amboina Key has flipped between Malaysian and Vietnamese control. But I mean, broadly, if you occupy a feature now, that's the one that's only ever been. People can challenge me. You know, I think so. You know, I could solve the South China Sea disputes in an afternoon, really. I would say, right, okay, you have that one, you have that one, you have that one, and then UNCLOS applies everywhere else. You know, you know, there's a bit before I get to that point. So that was the last slide, which you might have seen briefly there, was the picture of the Pedro Branca Lighthouse off Singapore, and you can see just how close the other rock is. The ICJ, wasn't it? Gave to Malaysia. You know, just the fact that they're only 400 meters apart didn't prevent the ICJ from saying, you can prove a claim to that one, you can prove a claim to that one. So in theory, you know, it should be possible to do the same thing, but that might not be the right thing to say in this room. I don't know, but it seems to me that must be one way forward. The Vietnamese would be very unhappy about losing the Paracels, but then if they lose the U-shaped line as well, then maybe it's worth it. I don't know.
Go ahead, please, Dr. Natalie.
Thanks. Bill, given your comments in relation to the Paracels and China's confusion around the Paracels, are you able to, I'm curious as to whether you can comment on China's claim to the Paracels as compared to Vietnam's and what your view is on that?
Yeah, I've written a book chapter on this and try and teased it out more thoroughly. But I mean, it is interesting that the early Nguyen court in the early part of the 19th century did seem, well, from some of the sources I've seen, did seem to make a territorial claim on the Paracels in the sort of 1820s period. And the only way I can explain this is that they hired a lot of European mercenaries to fight for them during the Vietnamese Civil War, the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, including sailors and people who were used to artillery and that kind of thing. And that maybe they advised the Nguyen court to go and make a European-style territorial claim. And one of the reasons they did that was because ships were being wrecked on the Paracels with cannon. And so they were salvaging the cannon and then using them in the Vietnamese civil wars. And so something I've seen, so that actually there was something which is very unusual among a Southeast Asian polity in that period. There seem to have been deliberate acts of sovereignty on the Paracels by the Vietnamese court in the first half of the 19th century, which all come to an end when the French arrive after 1856, whatever it is. And then it takes a very long time for the French to actually start taking an interest in the sovereignty of the Paracels and certainly the Spratlys. It doesn't happen until the 1930, late 20s, early 1930s. And again, that's it's a real battle between, it's the French colonists in Indochina that want to do it, and Paris that's saying don't, we don't want to upset anybody. But eventually they do make these claims, and they claim the Spratlys in the wrong way. They just sort of say, we claim all the islands in this bit of sea in 1930, and then the British say, you're not supposed to do it like that. And so that's why they have to go back and claim them a second time in 1933 and go and stick flags in them. But in the meantime, they've already started to claim the Paracels. And again, the impetus is guano, once again, and the rival things of Japan. One of the things I discovered was that in the run-up to the Second World War, the British were increasingly concerned that they were going to have to fight Japan during the mid to late 1930s. And so there are lots of secret surveys. The British go around trying to look for harbours that they might use in the event of a war. And they realize the Paracels might be a place. But then the Navy, the British Navy, the Royal Navy, thinks, if there's a war, those darn French are going to be neutral. Whereas the Chinese are going to fight. So therefore, the Admiralty tells the Foreign Office that we should be supporting the Chinese claim to the Paracels, because at least we'll be able to bully the Chinese into using it as a harbour during the war. Whereas if the French have the sovereignty of the Paracels, then they might deny access to the Royal Navy. So there's a bias in the British approach to the Paracels in the 1930s.
Thank you, Bill. I have a question to Justice Carpio. I think it was already made clear that the Chinese government do not have a historic right when it comes to the South China Sea. But as our all legal professionals are here, they wanted to know what is the basis of the Philippines in our sovereignty claim in the West Philippine Sea? Because we know for a fact that there are members of the legislative branch who are saying that, Thomas Cloma, that the 2016 Arbiton Award is not that enforceable, and even questioning our own position. So once and for all, Justice, can you inform our legal professionals here what is the basis and the ultimate reference of the Philippines when we talk about the West Philippine Sea? Thank you.
Well, first, our basis should start with the 1734 Pedro Murillo Velarde map, which was the first official map of Philippine territory during the Spanish regime. That's official because the symbol of the crown of Spain is there in the cartouche of the map. And it shows Panacot, which is Scarborough Shoal, and Los Bajos de Paragua. Paragua is the old name of Palawan. Los Bajos means the shoals. The shoals of Palawan, those are the Spratlys. Then we come to the 1808 map, the next official map of Philippine territory during the Spanish regime. It shows there Bajo de Masinloco, Scarborough Shoal, with deaf soundings. That 1808 map is a very unique map because in the entire Philippine archipelago, only one geologic feature has deaf sounding, Scarborough Shoal. All the rest of the country, all the islands of the Philippine archipelago have no deaf soundings except for Scarborough Shoal. And the last official map is this one, 1875. And you still have Scarborough Shoal there, Bajo de Masinloc or Scarborough. And the entire Spratlys are there with deaf soundings, with names. And this was adopted by the Americans as the official map of Philippine territory, 4 editions. So for 381 years, when we were ruled by Spain and the US, this was the official map of Philippine territory. Two colonial powers agreed that this is the map of Philippine territory. And then there is this, as I mentioned, this very strong principle in international law, ut possidetis juris. To preserve peace and stability in all regions of the world, international law developed this legal principle that the boundaries established by the colonial powers for their colonies are sacrosanct. They cannot be abandoned, as the ICJ ruled in their opinion on Mauritius, which was detached from the Chagos Archipelago was detached from Mauritius by UK. The ICJ opinion says you cannot detach it. So when the Americans were here, they could not detach anything. They could not detach Scarborough Shoal. They could not abandon the Spratlys because they have to preserve the territory of their colony for the benefit of the new state that will arise. And this principle of uti possessor juris binds all states, whether parties to the treaty or not. And China never objected, and China in fact admitted that Philippine territory is defined in 3 treaties. Treaty of 1898 of Paris, 1900 Treaty of Washington, and the 1930 Treaty with the British demarcating our southern boundary between British North Borneo and southern Philippines. So we have the strongest title. China came into the picture only in 1947, officially with their 1947 map and their 1947 handbook. That 1947 handbook is the first official claim of China over the Spratlys, and in that claim, China said, this is also claimed, the Spratlys are also claimed by the Philippines. That's fatal. It's a fatal defect in their claim because you cannot claim something that's been claimed already by another state. You can claim only what is terra nullius, land that is not claimed or owned by anyone. So their 1947 claim cannot pass muster in any international tribunal because they admit that somebody else claimed ahead of them. So I think we have the strongest title, the strongest claim, and what we should do is to challenge China, Vietnam, and Malaysia to submit the territorial dispute to arbitration because there is no treaty compelling them to submit this compulsory arbitration, unlike in a maritime dispute. So we have to challenge them. But we first have to agree what is really our legal basis, what is our legal and historical basis, because we have different stories. It's time to sit down and agree. We have the strongest title. We just have failed to articulate it correctly. Thank you.
Justice Scarpio, I think one of the questions also of Admiral J is, where is Tomas Cloma in this picture?
Tomas Cloma came into the picture only in the 1950s. If you base your claim starting in the 1950s, you lose to China, which officially claimed the Spratlys in 1947. You lose to Vietnam because Vietnam is claiming the Spratlys as successor to France, and France claimed it in 1932. So Tomas Cloma was born in 1904. That map is dated 1875, and it's all there in that map already. So I don't know why the DFA, our own DFA, thought of Tomas Cloma. So I'm trying to convince them, let's just abandon those Tomas Cloma. I have nothing against him. He meant well, but he did not discover the Spratlys because the Spratlys is named after Richard Spratley. And even Richard Spratley did not discover it. It was discovered by a fellow named James Horsburgh. And it's not even James Horsburgh because we have this 1875 map, we have an 1808 map, and 1734 map. We should start with the 1734 map. Thank you.
All right. We have one question from Irvin.
Thank you. Actually, Jeff told me to keep it short and sharp. So the Philippines, in its written responses to the July 2015 questions of Judge Rudiger Wolfram of the Annex 7 Arbitral Tribunal, the Philippines stated explicitly that it has brought all of its maritime claims in strict conformity of UNCLOS without regard to the 3 treaties. So we wanted to clarify, I think this question would also benefit the legal educators present here. We wanted to clarify, what does this mean without regard to the 3 treaties that the Philippines submitted to the Annex 7 Arbitral Tribunal in relation to interpreting Articles 1 and 2 of the Philippine Constitution. Because as far as I can observe, the common interpretation of Article 1 of the Philippine Constitution is that the three mentioned treaties were fully in effect. The box or polygon shaped of the treaty limits and its national territories. Thank you.
Well, UNCLOS governs only maritime disputes, so it will only set the baselines. From the baselines, you measure 12 nautical miles, that's your territorial sea. What the petitioners in Magallanes wanted was to declare all the waters within the Treaty of Paris lines as our territorial sea. If you do that, you will be claiming
Part of the territorial seas, which I think should be debunked.
yes, the Treaty of Paris lines have been erased practically by the Treaty of Washington because the Treaty of Washington retroacted and it includes islands outside the treaty line. So the treaty lines doesn't mean anything anymore. And if you look at the Treaty of Paris, it says the U.S., Spain cedes to the U.S. the islands. Only the islands were ceded. And at that time, islands had a 3 nautical mile territorial sea. In fact, Spain adopted a 6 nautical mile territorial sea in the late 1890s. But the US said we are only recognizing a 3 nautical mile territorial sea. So the seller, Spain, said, here are the islands with a 6 nautical mile territorial sea. But the US said, we accept the islands and 3 nautical mile territorial sea because that was the customary international law at that time, 3 nautical miles. So we cannot claim up to the limits of the Treaty of Paris lines because that will reach the high seas. And nobody will recognize that.
Last question, I apologize. You've mentioned customary international law and the Magallanes case. My question is that I think I've been reading some journal articles published a few years ago, and they mentioned that there is actually a domestication process of customary international law. And I think you already know this question posed to you by some critics is that why is it the Magallanes case was domesticated international law into Philippine domestic law without needing Philippine legislation?
Because our Constitution says we adopt the general principles of international law as part of the law of the land. And that has been interpreted to mean automatic. We don't need legislation. So whatever is the customary international law automatically becomes domestic law. And in the late 1960s, majority of the countries already adopted the 12 nautical mile territorial sea. And under UNCLOS, which was signed in 1982, took effect 1994, the 12 nautical territorial sea was the limit. We ratified UNCLOS in 1984. So we're bound by that. We adopted the present constitution in 1987. At the time we adopted the 1987 constitution, we had already ratified UNCLOS. So based on customary international law, based on our own constitution, based on our ratification of UNCLOS, we now follow the 12 nautical mile territorial sea. When the Magallona petition was filed, that was already in 2009. We already followed the 12 nautical mile territorial sea by constitution, because we incorporate customary international law immediately. We follow customary international law, and we already ratified UNCLOS. So we cannot claim a territorial sea beyond 12 nautical miles. What the petitioners wanted, that we claim territorial sea to include the exclusive economic zone and the high seas. We will be the only country in the world claiming the high seas as our territorial sea. Even China does not claim the high seas in the South China Sea as their territorial sea. In their territorial sea law, they claim only 12 nautical miles territorial sea. Beyond that, they're claiming historic rights, which we questioned in the tribunal, and the tribunal upheld that. You cannot claim historic rights beyond the territorial sea. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're like almost 8 p.m., so maybe we can end here. Justice Carpio will join us again tomorrow. Thank you so much, Dr. Bill Hayton, Justice Antonio Carpio. And that ends our program tonight. See you all tomorrow. Thank you.